Chapter 1. The Whisper in the Wool. In the sleepy village of St. Mary Mead, the sun peeked over the green hills, painting the cobblestone streets with a golden glow. Miss Jane Marple sat in her favorite armchair by the window, her knitting needles clicking softly. The air smelled of fresh roses from her garden, and the distant church bells rang for Sunday service. She adjusted her shawl, her sharp blue eyes scanning the street where villagers hurried to church. To anyone watching, she was just a sweet old lady knitting away her morning. But Miss Marple was never just anything. Her mind, quick as a fox, caught every whisper, every glance, every tiny hint of secrets floating through the village like dandelion seeds. Today, her ears were tuned to the chatter she'd hear at church. St. Mary Mead was a place where gossip grew faster than weeds, and Miss Marple knew how to pick the right ones. She tucked her knitting into a wicker basket, slipped on her Sunday hat with its little lace trim, and stepped out into the crisp morning. The path to the church wound past ivy-covered cottages, where curtains twitched as neighbors peeked out. She smiled to herself. People thought they hid their secrets, but to Miss Marple, they were as clear as a sunny day. At St. Mary's Church, the pews were packed with familiar faces. Mrs. Price, the baker's wife, fussed with her scarf. Mr. Hodge, the grumpy gardener, sat stiffly in the back. And there, in the front row, was young Clarabelle, her face pale and her hands twisting a handkerchief. Miss Marple noticed it all, filing each detail away like a librarian sorting books. The vicar droned on about kindness, but Miss Marple's mind was on Clara. The girl looked nervous, like a cat near a dog. Something was wrong. After the service, the ladies gathered in the churchyard, sipping tea from chipped cups and trading stories. Miss Marple joined them, her knitting needles back in her hands, clicking away. She didn't need to ask questions. People spilled their thoughts around her like sugar from a torn bag. Mrs. Price leaned close, her voice low but eager. "Did you hear about the Bell family's trouble?" she whispered, glancing at Clara, who stood alone by a yew tree. "That old necklace of theirs, the one with the ruby? Gone. Stolen, they say." Miss Marple's needles paused for half a second. The Bell necklace was no small thing. It had been in Clara's family for generations, a heavy gold chain with a ruby the size of a pigeon's egg. People said it was worth more than half the village. "Stolen," Miss Marple said softly, her voice gentle but curious. "How dreadful!" "Oh yes," Mrs. Price went on, her eyes gleaming. "Clara's mother swears it was in the safe last week. Now it's vanished, and they're pointing fingers at everyone. Even poor Tommy, the delivery boy, got a scolding, though he swears he never touched it." Miss Marple nodded, her face calm, but her mind was racing. A stolen necklace wasn't just a theft. In a village like this, it was a crack in the trust that held people together. She glanced at Clara again, who was now talking to Mrs. Dane, the postmistress. Clara's hands shook as she spoke, and Mrs. Dane's face was tight with worry. Miss Marple's needles started clicking again, faster now. She knew gossip wasn't just idle talk. It was a map, and she was already tracing the paths. Back at home, Miss Marple brewed a pot of tea and sat by her fire. Her knitting lay in her lap, but her thoughts were on the necklace. She remembered Clara's mother, Mrs. Bell, a proud woman who loved showing off that ruby at village fairs. And she also remembered Clara's brother, Henry, who'd left St. Mary Mead years ago after some trouble nobody liked to talk about. Could he be back? Or was it someone closer, someone in the village who knew the Bell house well? The next morning, Miss Marple visited the village shop, where gossip flowed like the tea at church. Mrs. Green, the shopkeeper, was dusting shelves and chatting to anyone who'd listen. "It's a shame about the Bells," she said, as Miss Marple picked out a skein of blue wool. Clara says they're sure it was an inside job. The safe wasn't broken in, you see. Someone knew the combination." Miss Marple's eyebrows lifted slightly. "The combination? That's interesting," she said, her voice as soft as the wool in her hands. "Who might know such a thing?" Mrs. Green shrugged, but her eyes sparkled with the thrill of a good story. "Well, Clara's mother, of course, and Clara, I suppose. Maybe old Mr. Bell, but he's been poorly and doesn't leave his room much. Oh, and there's that maid, Lucy, who's been with them forever. But she's loyal as a dog, isn't she?" Miss Marple smiled and paid for her wool. Loyal as a dog, perhaps, but dogs could be tempted with the right bone. She walked home slowly, her mind turning over the pieces. A safe that wasn't forced open meant someone trusted, someone close. But why steal the necklace now? And where was it? That afternoon, Miss Marple sat in her garden, knitting a scarf and watching the world go by. Clara passed by, her face still pale, and Miss Marple called her over for tea. The girl hesitated, but came, sitting stiffly on the garden bench. "You must be so upset about the necklace," Miss Marple said kindly, pouring tea. "It's such a beautiful piece." Clara's eyes filled with tears. "It's not just the necklace," she whispered. "It's what it means. Mother says it's our family's pride. Without it, we're nothing." Miss Marple patted her hand. "Now, dear, a family is more than a jewel. Tell me, when did you last see it?" Clara bit her lip. "Last Sunday, before church. Mother checked the safe like she always does. Then Tuesday, it was gone. We've searched everywhere." Miss Marple nodded, her needles clicking. "And who was in the house that day?" "Just us," Clara said quickly. "Me, Mother, Father, and Lucy. And Tommy brought the groceries, but he didn't go near the safe." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Of course not," she said, but her mind was already spinning. Tommy, the delivery boy, was young and clumsy, but he had sharp eyes. And Lucy, the maid, knew every corner of that house. Then there was the safes combination, a secret that wasn't so secret if someone was clever enough to listen. Over the next few days, Miss Marple kept her ears open. At the post office, Mrs. Dane mentioned Tommy's new bicycle, a fancy one for a boy with no money. At the bakery, Mrs. Price whispered about Lucy's sudden trips to town, buying things she couldn't afford. Miss Marple didn't judge. She listened, pieced things together, and knitted. Her scarf grew longer, and so did her list of questions. On Friday, Miss Marple visited the Bell house, bringing a jar of her homemade jam as an excuse. Mrs. Bell welcomed her, though her face was tight with worry. The house was grand but old, with creaky floors and heavy curtains. Miss Marple sat in the parlor, sipping tea and chatting about the weather. Her eyes, though, were everywhere, on the dusty safe in the corner, the locked desk, and the way Lucy moved quietly, almost too quietly. "Such a pity about the necklace," Miss Marple said, her voice gentle. "Do you think it might still be in the house? Sometimes things are misplaced, not stolen." Mrs. Bell shook her head. "No, it's gone. The safe was locked tight. Someone took it." Miss Marple nodded, her needles clicking. "And the combination. Only you and Clara know it." Mrs. Bell hesitated, just for a moment. "Yes," she said. "And, well, my husband, but he's too ill to meddle with such things." Miss Marple smiled, but filed that hesitation away. Back at home, she thought about Mr. Bell. Poorly, yes, but was he as helpless as everyone thought? And what about Henry, the missing son? Gossip from years ago said he'd run off after a fight with his father. Could he have returned, needing money? The breakthrough came on Saturday at the village market. Miss Marple was buying apples when she overheard Tommy talking to a friend. "Got a good deal on that bike," he boasted. "Some city fellow paid me to deliver a package, no questions asked." Miss Marple's ears pricked up. A city fellow?
That wasn't common in St. Mary Mead. That evening, Miss Marple invited Clara for tea again. This time, she asked about Tommy. "He's a good boy," she said, but her voice wavered. "He wouldn't steal." "Of course not," Miss Marple said, "but he might know something. Young boys see more than we think." Clara looked away, and Miss Marple knew she'd struck a chord. The next day, Miss Marple spoke to Tommy herself, catching him by the church gate. "Nice bicycle," she said, smiling. "Must have cost a pretty penny." Tommy blushed. "Got it cheap," he mumbled. "A city man paid me to take a box to the train station. Didn't look inside." Miss Marple's heart quickened, but her face stayed calm. "A box? How interesting," she said. "Was it heavy?" "Sort of," he said.
Chapter 2. Teacups and Tangled Lies. The afternoon sun spilled through the lace curtains of Miss Marple's cozy parlor in St. Mary Mead. Her teapot steamed, filling the room with the sweet scent of Earl Grey. She arranged a plate of scones, their golden tops dusted with sugar, and set out her best china cups. Today, she was hosting tea for the village ladies, a perfect chance to listen to the chatter that swirled like cream in her tea. Her knitting needles rested in her basket, but her sharp mind was already at work, ready to catch any hint of trouble hidden in the gossip. The doorbell chimed, and in came Mrs. Price, the baker's wife, her cheeks rosy from the walk. Behind her was Mrs. Dane, the postmistress, clutching a new scarf, and young Clara Bell, still shaken from the necklace theft last week. Miss Marple greeted them with her warm smile, her blue eyes twinkling like she knew a secret. She didn't need to ask questions. The ladies would talk, and she'd listen, piecing together their words like a patchwork quilt. As they settled around the table, Mrs. Price helped herself to a scone and leaned forward. "Have you heard about Mrs. Lacey?" she whispered, her voice low but eager. "She's been poorly, but I saw her at the chemist yesterday buying all sorts of odd things. Powders, tonics, looked suspicious to me." Miss Marple poured tea, her face calm. "Poorly, you say? That's a shame." Her voice was soft, but her mind snapped to attention. Mrs. Lacey was a stout woman in her 50s, always cheerful, but lately she'd been pale and jumpy. Powders and tonics could mean a cold or something darker. Mrs. Dane nodded, her scarf slipping as she reached for her cup. "I heard her coughing at the post office. Sounded dreadful. But you know, her husband's been acting strange, too. Mr. Lacey's been at the pub more than usual, and not just for a pint. He's been whispering with that new barman, Joe." Clara, nibbling a scone, looked up. "Joe's nice," she said quietly. "He helped me carry my parcels last week." But her voice wavered, and Miss Marple noticed the way her fingers tightened around her teacup. The talk turned to village news, new curtains at the vicarage, a lost cat. But Miss Marple kept thinking about Mrs. Lacey. She remembered a story from years ago about an aunt who'd been poorly and turned out to be poisoned by her own cook over a will. People didn't change, she thought. Greed, fear, love. They twisted folks into knots, and she knew how to untangle them. The next day, Miss Marple took her morning walk to the village chemist. Mr. Gibbs, the chemist, was sweeping the floor, his glasses slipping down his nose. "Good morning, Miss Marple," he said, smiling. "Need anything for those roses of yours?" She chuckled. "Not today, Mr. Gibbs. I was just wondering about Mrs. Lacey. I heard she's been under the weather." Mr. Gibbs's smile faded. "Oh, yes, she's been in a lot lately. Bought some cough syrup, a few powders for sleep. Nothing unusual, but—" He hesitated, then lowered his voice. "She seemed nervous, kept looking over her shoulder like someone was watching." Miss Marple's knitting, tucked in her bag, seemed to call to her. She thanked Mr. Gibbs and walked home, her mind buzzing. Nervous? That didn't sound like a cold. It sounded like fear. Back in her parlor, she sat by the window, her needles clicking as she thought. Mrs. Lacey's cough, the powders, Mr. Lacey's pub talks, Joe's quick hands. It was a puzzle, and she was missing a piece. That afternoon, Miss Marple visited the pub, a small place with dark beams and the smell of ale. Joe, a tall man with quick hands, was wiping glasses. Miss Marple ordered a lemonade and chatted about the weather. "You're new here, aren't you?" she said, her voice sweet. "Must be hard learning all our village ways." Joe grinned. "Not so bad, miss. Folks are friendly. Mr. Lacey's been a big help, showing me the ropes." "Oh, Mr. Lacey's a good sort," she said, watching his face, "though I hear he's been here a lot lately." Joe's grin faltered, just for a second. "Suppose so," he said, turning to polish another glass. Miss Marple sipped her lemonade, her eyes sharp. Something wasn't right. Over the next few days, the village buzzed with talk about Mrs. Lacey. At the shop, Mrs. Green said she'd seen her stumble in the street, looking dizzy. At the church, Mrs. Price whispered that Mr. Lacey had bought a new suit, far too fancy for a clerk. Miss Marple listened, her needles clicking faster. She remembered her aunt's case again. The slow poison, the greedy cook, the husband who'd looked the other way. Could it be happening here? On Thursday, Miss Marple invited Clara for tea, hoping to learn more. Clara, still shy, sat twisting her handkerchief. "Mrs. Lacey was kind to me after the necklace trouble," she said, "but she's been so quiet lately. I saw her in the garden yesterday, burning papers. Looked like letters." Miss Marple's heart skipped. "Letters? How curious." She poured more tea, her mind racing. Burning letters meant secrets. Secrets meant motive. That evening, she walked to the Lacey house, a neat cottage with roses climbing the walls. Mrs. Lacey answered the door, her face pale and her hands shaking. "Miss Marple, what a surprise," she said, her voice thin. "Come in." They sat in the kitchen, where a kettle whistled. Miss Marple noticed a bottle of powder on the counter, half hidden by a teapot. "You've not been well, I hear," she said gently. "I do hope you're feeling better." Mrs. Lacey's eyes darted to the powder. "Just a cough," she said quickly. "Nothing to worry about." But Miss Marple was worried. She chatted about the village, watching Mrs. Lacey's nervous hands. When Mr. Lacey came home, he was all smiles, but his eyes were cold. "Nice to see you, Miss Marple," he said, his voice too loud. "Everything all right?" "Oh, quite," she said, her smile sweet. But as she left, she saw him glance at the powder bottle, and her stomach tightened. Back home, Miss Marple sat by her fire, knitting forgotten. The pieces were coming together. Mrs. Lacey's cough, the powders, Mr. Lacey's pubcocks, Joe's quick hands, and the burned letters. It smelled like poison, slow and sneaky. She remembered a case from her youth, A wife poisoned by her husband for insurance money, with a barman who'd mix the drinks. Was Joe helping Mr. Lacey, or was it someone else? The next morning, Miss Marple went to the post office. Mrs. Dane was sorting letters, her scarf bright against the gray counter. "Mrs. Lacey's been getting odd post," she said when Miss Marple asked. "Letters with no return address. I thought it was strange." Miss Marple's needles paused in her bag. "No return address. How peculiar." She thanked Mrs. Dane and hurried home, her mind spinning. Letters, powders, a nervous wife, a husband with a new suit. It was a story she'd heard before, but she needed proof. On Saturday, tragedy struck. Mrs. Lacey collapsed at the market, her face gray. The doctor rushed her to the hospital, and the village hummed with worry. Miss Marple didn't wait. She went to the constable, her voice calm but firm. "You might want to check Mrs. Lacey's powders and perhaps ask Joe about his chats with Mr. Lacey." The constable, used to her suggestions, acted fast. The powders were tested and found to contain arsenic, small doses that built up over weeks. Joe, under questioning, admitted Mr. Lacey had paid him to slip powders into Mrs. Lacey's tea, claiming they were vitamins. The burned letters? Love notes from Mr. Lacey to a woman in the next town, found in the ashes by a sharp-eyed gardener. Mr. Lacey had wanted his wife gone to start a new life. By Sunday, Mr. Lacey was...
Chapter 3. Garden Fences and Hidden Motives. The morning mist hung low over St. Mary Mead, wrapping the village in a soft gray blanket. Miss Jane Marple stood in her garden, clipping roses with her small shears, her sharp eyes scanning the quiet street. Her cottage, with its neat flower beds and ivy-covered walls, was a perfect spot to watch the world go by. She wore her old straw hat, tilted just so, and her knitting lay in a basket by the door. To anyone passing, she was just tending her roses, but Miss Marple was always listening, always watching. Gossip drifted over garden fences like pollen, and she knew how to catch it. Today, her ears were tuned to the chatter from next door. Old Mr. Hodge, the village gardener, was raking leaves in his yard, muttering to himself. His gruff voice carried over the low wooden fence, and Miss Marple caught words like cheat and land. She snipped a rose, her hands steady, but her mind racing. Mr. Hodge was a cranky sort, always grumbling about his aching back or the weather. But this sounded different, angrier, personal. Later that morning, Miss Marple walked to the village square, her basket swinging lightly. The air smelled of fresh bread from the bakery, and children darted past, laughing. At the greengrocer's stall, she picked out apples and listened to Mrs. Green, the shopkeeper, who loves a good story. "Mr. Hodge was in earlier," Mrs. Green said, weighing the apples. "Red in the face he was, going on about Mr. Turner's stealing his land." Miss Marple's eyebrows lifted slightly. "Stealing land? That's a strong word." Her voice was gentle, but her mind filed the detail away. Mr. Turner was a newcomer, a slick man with a big smile who'd bought the old mill house last year. He'd been planting hedges, claiming bits of land near Mr. Hodge's garden. Land disputes in St. Mary Mead weren't just about dirt. They were about pride, history, and sometimes darker things. Back home, Miss Marple sat by her window, knitting a soft gray scarf. Her needles clicked like a clock, steady and sure. She thought about Mr. Hodge, who'd tended the village gardens for decades, and Mr. Turner, who seemed too polished for their quiet lanes. She remembered a story from her youth about a farmer blackmailed over a land deal gone sour. Could Mr. Hodge be hiding something? Or was Mr. Turner the one with secrets? That afternoon, she strolled past Mr. Hodge's garden, her basket over her arm. He was digging, his spade hitting the earth hard. "Good day, Mr. Hodge," she called, pausing by the fence. "Your roses are looking lovely." He grunted, barely looking up. "Not as lovely as they should be. That Turner's been snooping around, saying my fence is on his land. Cheek of him." Miss Marple nodded, her face kind, but her eyes sharp. "Oh dear, that must be upsetting. Have you spoken to him?" "Tried," Mr. Hodge snapped, wiping sweat from his brow. "He's just laughing, says he's got papers to prove it's his. Papers! I've been here 40 years. Miss Marple smiled and moved on, but her mind was buzzing. Papers could be forged or bought. She remembered Mr. Turner's flashy car, his new suits, money he shouldn't have, not on a clerk's wage. Was he pushing Mr. Hodge for more than just land? The next day, at the church knitting circle, the ladies were full of talk. Mrs. Price, nibbling a biscuit, leaned close. "I heard Mr. Hodge threatened Mr. Turner at the pub last night," she whispered. "Said he'd make him regret crossing him." Clara Bell, knitting a lumpy sock, looked worried. "Mr. Hodge isn't like that," she said. "He's just upset. That land's been his family's forever." Miss Marple's needles clicked faster. Threats weren't Mr. Hodge's style. He was all bark, no bite. But threats meant anger, and anger meant secrets. She thought of her old friend's uncle who'd lost his farm to a shady deal and turned bitter. Was Mr. Hodge being pushed too far? On Wednesday, Miss Marple went to the post office where Mrs. Dane was sorting mail. "Any news?" Miss Marple asked, buying stamps. Mrs. Dane glanced around, then whispered, "Mr. Turner got a letter from a lawyer in town. Something about land deeds. Looked official, but he was nervous when he opened it." Miss Marple's heart quickened. Nervous? How curious. She tucked her stamps away, her mind spinning. A nervous man with official papers wasn't a good sign. She walked home slowly, thinking of blackmail. Someone with power over Mr. Hodge could use land as leverage. But who? That evening, she sat in her garden, knitting under the fading light. Mr. Hodge was back at work, but his spade moved slower now, like he was tired. Across the lane, Mr. Turner's car pulled up, and a stranger stepped out, a thin man in a dark coat. They spoke quietly, heads close, then drove off. Miss Marple's needles paused. A stranger meant trouble. The next morning, the village woke to a shock. Mr. Hodge's shed had been broken into, his tools scattered, and a crude note pinned to the door. "Give it up, old man." The constable was called, and the village buzzed with worry. Miss Marple visited Mr. Hodge, bringing a jar of her jam as an excuse. He was pale, his hands shaking as he showed her the note. "It's Turner," he growled. "He wants my land, and he'll do anything to get it." Miss Marple patted his arm. "We'll sort this out," she said softly, but her eyes were on the note's handwriting, neat. Too neat for a quick threat. She remembered a case from years ago where a blackmailer used notes to scare a shopkeeper into selling cheap. Was Mr. Turner playing the same game? Over the next few days, Miss Marple listened closely. At the shop, Mrs. Green said Mr. Turner had been bragging about a big deal. At the pub, Joe the barman mentioned the stranger, a city type, who'd paid for drinks with crisp notes. Miss Marple's scarf grew longer, and so did her suspicions. She invited Clara for tea, hoping for more clues. "Mr. Hodge helped me with my garden once," Clara said, sipping tea. "He told me about his land, how his father won it in a bet. He's proud of it." Miss Marple nodded. Pride can make people stubborn or desperate. She thought of Mr. Turner's stranger, the lawyer's letter, the note on the shed. It felt like a trap, but for whom? On Friday, Miss Marple walked to the mill house where Mr. Turner was pruning his new hedges. "Good morning," she called, her smile sweet. "Your garden's coming along nicely." He grinned, too wide. "Thanks, Miss Marple. Just making it my own." She nodded, her eyes on his hands. Clean, no dirt under the nails, not a gardener's hands. "I heard about Mr. Hodges' trouble," she said. "Such a shame." Mr. Turner's grin faded. "Old fool's too attached to that patch. He'll see sense soon." Miss Marple smiled and left, but her heart was racing. That night she sat by her fire, knitting forgotten. The pieces were falling into place. Mr. Turner wasn't just after land, he was after control. The stranger, the lawyer's letter, the note on the shed. It was a scheme to scare Mr. Hodge into selling cheap. But why? Money, of course, or something buried deeper. On Saturday, she went to the constable, her voice calm. "You might check Mr. Turner's papers and ask about a man in a dark coat." The constable sent a telegram to the town lawyer. The reply came fast. The land deed was fake, forged by a known crook, the stranger. The constable searched Mr. Turner's house and found letters planning the scam. The stranger was arrested in town, and Mr. Turner confessed, hoping to sell Mr. Hodges' land for a quick profit. The note was his, written to scare the old man. Mr. Hodges' land was safe, and the village cheered. On Sunday, Mr. Hodge brought Miss Marple a rose from his garden, his gruff face soft. "You're a wonder," he said. She smiled, picking up her knitting. "Just listening, Mr. Hodge," she said. But as her needles clicked, she knew more secrets were hiding in St. Mary Mead, waiting for her to find them.
Chapter 4. The Vicarage Veneer. The sun dipped low over St. Mary Mead, casting long shadows across the village green. Miss Jane Marple sat on her porch, her knitting needles clicking softly as she worked on a pale blue shawl. The air carried the scent of fresh-cut grass and the faint chime of church bells. To the world, she was just an old lady enjoying the evening, but her sharp eyes missed nothing. Every glance, every whispered word in the village was a thread in her tapestry of secrets, and she was always weaving. Today her thoughts were on the vicarage, a tidy house next to St. Mary's Church. The vicar, Mr. Clement, was a kind man with a warm smile, but lately Miss Marple had noticed a stiffness in his greetings, a flicker of worry in his eyes. Gossip had been swirling, and she knew better than to ignore it. In St. Mary Mead, whispers often hid truths as sharp as her knitting needles. At the weekly church meeting, the ladies gathered in the vicarage hall, their voices buzzing like bees. Miss Jane Marple sat in a corner, her knitting needles clicking softly as she worked on a pale blue shawl. Mrs. Price, the baker's wife, was holding court, her teacup balanced precariously. "I saw Mr. Clement at the station yesterday," she said, her voice low. "He was sending a package, looked nervous as anything. And that new assistant of his, Mr. Finch, always scribbling in that notebook of his." Miss Marple's needles paused for a heartbeat. "A package," she said softly, her voice as gentle as a breeze. "How curious." Mrs. Dane, the postmistress, leaned in, her scarf slipping. "I saw that package. Big, heavy, addressed to some office in town. Mr. Clement said it was old books, but he didn't look happy about it." Clara Bell, sitting quietly with her tea, added, "Mr. Finch is strange. He's always at the vicarage late, locking the study door. I saw him through the window last week, counting money." Miss Marple nodded, her face calm but her mind racing. A nervous vicar, a secretive assistant, a mysterious package. It was a puzzle, and she loved puzzles. She remembered a story from her girlhood about a curate who'd forged checks to cover gambling debts. People hid their sins behind smiles, but Miss Marple knew how to peek behind the mask. The next morning she walked to the church, her basket over her arm. Mr. Clement was in the garden pruning roses, his hands clumsy with the shears. "Good morning, Miss Marple," he said, his smile tight. "Fine day, isn't it?" "Lovely," she replied, her eyes on his trembling fingers. "I hear you've been sending books to town, sharing knowledge, I suppose." His face paled. "Oh, yes, just some old volumes," he mumbled, turning back to his roses. Miss Marple smiled and moved on, but her heart quickened. Lies were like weeds. They grew fast and choked the truth. At the village shop, Mrs. Green was stacking jars, her tongue as busy as her hands. "Mr. Finch bought a new pen yesterday, fancy one, too, with gold trim. Odd for a vicar's assistant, don't you think?" Miss Marple nodded, picking out a skein of wool. "Very odd," she said. Mr. Finch was young, with slick hair and quick eyes, always scribbling in that notebook. Was he writing sermons or something else? That afternoon, she sat in her garden, knitting and thinking. The vicarage had always been a place of trust, but now it felt like a stage, with Mr. Clement and Mr. Finch playing parts. She remembered a Bible story about a false prophet hiding greed behind holy words. Was Mr. Finch leading the vicar astray, or was Mr. Clement not as innocent as he seemed? On Wednesday, Miss Marple visited the vicarage, bringing a jar of her homemade jam. Mr. Clement welcomed her into the parlor, where tea was set out. Mr. Finch was there, his notebook tucked under his arm, his smile too smooth. "Pleasure to see you, Miss Marple," he said, but his eyes darted to the door. They chatted about the weather, but Miss Marple's gaze wandered. On the desk, she saw a stack of papers, some with official stamps. "You've been busy," she said, nodding at the desk. "Church business, I suppose." Mr. Clement coughed. "Yes, just records," he said, his voice thin. Mr. Finch jumped in. "Donations, keeping the books straight." Miss Marple smiled, but her mind was spinning. Donations didn't need locked doors or late nights. She thanked them and left, her eyes catching a glimpse of Mr. Finch slipping his notebook into a drawer. That evening, at the pub, she sipped lemonade and listened to Joe, the barman. "Mr. Finch was here last night," he said, wiping a glass. "Met a man in a fancy coat, talking about investments. Looked like big money." Miss Marple's needles, tucked in her bag, seemed to click in her head. Investments, packages, nervous glances, it smelled like forgery or worse. She thought of a case from years ago where a clerk had faked documents to sell church land. Was Mr. Finch forging papers? And was Mr. Clement a victim or part of it? On Thursday, the village woke to a stir. A notice had gone up at the church announcing a sale of vicarage land to fund repairs. The villagers were upset. That land had been sacred for generations. Miss Marple went to the church where Mr. Clement was facing angry questions. "It's for the roof," he said, his voice shaky. Mr. Finch stood by him, calm and smiling. Miss Marple watched from the back, her knitting in her lap. She noticed Mr. Finch's hand on Mr. Clement's shoulder, like he was steering him. She remembered a cousin who'd been bullied into signing papers by a slick friend. Was Mr. Finch pushing the vicar? She invited Clara for tea, hoping for more clues. Clara, twisting her handkerchief, said, "I saw Mr. Finch at the station, sending another package. He looked sneaky, like he didn't want to be seen." Miss Marple's heart skipped. "Another package?" she said. "Interesting." She poured more tea, her mind racing. 2 packages, official papers, A land sale. It was adding up to something ugly. On Friday, she walked to the post office. Mrs. Green was sorting letters, her scarf bright as ever. Mr. Finch sent a package to a bank in town, heavy like it was full of papers. He paid extra to rush it. Miss Marple nodded, her needles pausing in her bag. Papers to a bank meant movie, and money meant motive. That night she sat by her fire, knitting, forgotten. The pieces were falling together. Mr. Finch wasn't just an assistant. He was a schemer, forging documents to sell church land for profit. Mr. Clement, weak and worried, was being used. On Saturday, the disaster struck. The church safe was found open, important deeds missing. The village was in an uproar, blaming Mr. Clement. Miss Marple didn't wait. She went to the constable, her voice soft but firm. "You might check Mr. Finch's notebook and ask about those packages." The constable, trusting her instincts, searched the vicarage. In Mr. Finch's notebook, they found forged deeds ready to sell the land to a shady buyer, the man in the fancy coat. The packages held copies sent to trick the bank. Mr. Finch confessed under pressure, admitting he'd pressured Mr. Clement, who'd been too scared to resist. The vicar, ashamed, promised to step down until trust was rebuilt. By Sunday, the village was calmer. The deeds returned, the sale stopped. Mr. Clement thanked Miss Marple, his eyes wet. "You saw what I couldn't," he said. She smiled, picking up her knitting. "People talk, dear. I just listen." But as her needles clicked, she knew St. Mary Mead held more secrets, and she'd be ready to unravel them.
Chapter 5. Postmistress's Parcel of Perils. The morning sun peeked through the mist in St. Mary Mead, painting the village in soft gold. Miss Jane Marple stood at her kitchen window, sipping tea and watching the street come alive. Her knitting needles lay quiet in their basket, but her mind was busy, catching every detail like a spider in its web. The post office, just across the lane, was already bustling, and Miss Marple knew that's where the village's secrets gathered, tucked into envelopes and whispered over counters. Mrs. Dane, the postmistress, was the heart of that bustle, her bright scarves a beacon in the gray morning. Miss Marple had noticed her lately, looking jumpy, her hands fluttering more than usual. Gossip was the village's lifeblood, and Mrs. Dane was its pump. Today, Miss Marple decided, was a good day to buy stamps and listen. She tucked her knitting into her basket and strolled to the post office, her steps slow but her eyes sharp. Inside, the air smelled of paper and ink. Mrs. Dane was behind the counter, sorting letters, her scarf a vibrant green. "Good morning, Miss Marple," she said, her smile tight. "Stamps, is it?" "Yes, please," Miss Marple replied, her voice gentle. "Busy day, I see. Any interesting post?" Mrs. Dane's hands paused. "Oh, the usual, though there was a queer parcel yesterday, heavy, wrapped in brown paper, no return address. Went to a shop in town, but it gave me the shivers." Miss Marple's heart quickened, but her face stayed calm. No return address? How odd. She paid for her stamps, her mind already turning. A parcel with no sender was like a story with no ending, trouble waiting to happen. Back home, she sat by her fire, knitting a soft pink scarf. Her needles clicked steadily, but her thoughts were on that parcel. She remembered a case from years ago about a smuggler who hid stolen goods in plain packages sent through sleepy villages like this one. Could St. Mary Mead be part of something bigger? At the church knitting circle that afternoon, the ladies were full of talk. Mrs. Price, nibbling a biscuit, leaned close. "Mrs. Dane's been odd lately," she whispered. "I saw her at the post office checking that same parcel over and over, like she was scared of it." Clarabelle, twisting her yarn, nodded. "I was there when it came in. A man dropped it off, rough-looking, with a cap pulled low. Mrs. Dane looked like she'd seen a ghost." Miss Marple's needles moved faster. "A rough man, you say? That's interesting. Her voice was soft, but her mind was racing. A mysterious parcel, a nervous postmistress, a stranger. It was a puzzle, and she was eager to solve it. The next day, Miss Marple visited the village shop, where Mrs. Green was stacking tins. "Heard about Mrs. Dane's parcel?" Mrs. Green said, her eyes gleaming. "She told me it was heavy, like it was full of metal, said it rattled when she moved it." Miss Marple nodded, picking out a skein of wool. "Metal? How curious." She walked home, her basket swinging, her thoughts on smuggling. Metal could mean coins, jewelry, or something worse. She remembered a story about smugglers using post offices to move stolen goods, hiding them in plain sight. That evening she sat by her fire, knitting under the fading light. Across the lane, the post office was quiet, but Mrs. Dane was still there, locking up late. Miss Marple noticed a shadow near the back door, a man, cap low, slipping away into the dusk. Her niddles paused. Was he the same stranger Clara saw? On Wednesday, Miss Marple went back to the post office, bringing a letter to mail. Mrs. Dane was pale, her scarf slipping as she stamped the envelope. "Everything all right, dear?" Miss Marple asked, her voice kind. "Yes, just busy," she said, her eyes darting to a shelf behind her. Miss Marple followed her glance and saw a stack of parcels, one wrapped in familiar brown paper. "That's a fine parcel," she said lightly. "Another one like yesterday's?" Mrs. Dane's face flushed. "Just supplies," she mumbled, turning away. Miss Marple smiled, but her heart was pounding. Lies were like loose threads. Pull one, and the whole thing unraveled. That night, she sat by her fire, knitting forgotten. The pieces were coming together. A heavy parcel, a rough stranger, Mrs. Dane's nerves. It smelled like a smuggling ring, small but clever, using the post office as a hub. She thought of her old neighbor, caught passing stolen watches through the mail. Was Mrs. Dane involved, or just scared? On Thursday, the village buzzed with news. Another parcel had arrived, same brown paper, same no-return address. Mrs. Green said she'd seen the stranger again, lingering near the post office. Miss Marple decided to act. She invited Clara for tea, hoping for more clues. "Mrs. Dane's been so quiet," Clara said, sipping tea. "I saw her hide a parcel under the counter yesterday, like she didn't want anyone to see it." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Hidden, you say? How interesting." She poured more tea, her mind spinning. Hidden parcel meant guilt or fear. She needed to see it. On Friday, she went to the post office early, before the morning rush. Mrs. Dane was alone, sorting mail, her hands shaking. Miss Marple chatted about the weather, her eyes on that shelf. When Mrs. Dane stepped away to fetch stamps, Miss Marple peeked at the parcel. It was heavy, with a faint rattle, just as Mrs. Green had said. That afternoon, she visited the pub where Joe the barman was wiping glasses. "Seen that rough fellow around?" she asked, sipping lemonade. Joe nodded. "Comes in late, always pays cash. Met a man in a suit last night talking about deliveries. Sounded shady." Miss Marple's needles, tucked in her bag, seemed to click in her head. Deliveries, parcels, a stranger. It was a chain, and Mrs. Dane was a link. But was she a willing one? On Saturday, trouble struck. The post office was broken into overnight, the brown paper parcel gone. Mrs. Dane was in tears, telling the constable she'd been threatened by a man to hold the packages or else. The village was in a tizzy, whispering about thieves. Miss Marple didn't wait. She went to the constable, her voice calm. "You might check the train station," she said, "and ask about a man in a cap." The constable, trusting her hunches, sent men to the station. They found the stranger, cap low, with the parcel, full of stolen silver, smuggled from a city gang. Mrs. Dane, questioned gently, admitted she'd been scared into helping, threatened with harm to her family. The stranger and his city contact were arrested, and the post office was safe again. On Sunday, Mrs. Dane hugged Miss Marple at church, her scarf bright, but her eyes brighter. "You saved me," she whispered. Miss Marple smiled, picking up her knitting. "People talk, dear. I just listen." But as her nettles clicked, she knew St. Mary Mead's secrets were far from over, and she'd be ready for the next one.
Chapter 6. Knitted Clues and Village Vows.
The late afternoon sun bathed St. Mary Mead in a warm glow, its light filtering through the apple trees in Miss Jane Marple's garden. She sat in her wicker chair, knitting a soft lavender scarf, her needles clicking like a gentle metronome. From her porch, she could see the village bustling quietly, children playing, neighbors chatting over fences. To anyone watching, she was just an old lady enjoying the day. But Miss Marple's sharp eyes and sharper mind were always at work, catching the whispers that floated through the village like autumn leaves. Today, her thoughts were on the knitting circle, a weekly gathering at the village hall where the ladies stitched and gossiped. It was a gold mine of secrets, and Miss Marple never missed it. Yesterday's meeting had been lively, with talk of a broken engagement that had the village buzzing. Young Emily Shaw, a pretty girl with bright eyes, had called off her wedding to Tom Reed, the blacksmith's son. The reason? Nobody knew for sure, but the whispers were loud and full of guesses. Miss Marple tucked her knitting into her basket and headed to the village hall, her steps slow but purposeful. The hall smelled of tea and fresh scones, and the ladies were already seated, their needles flashing. Mrs. Price, the baker's wife, was in the middle of a story, her voice low and eager. "Emily was crying at the shop yesterday," she said, her eyes wide. "Said Tom wasn't who she thought he was. Something about a letter she found." Miss Marple settled into her chair, her needles picking up their rhythm. "A letter," she said softly, her voice as gentle as a breeze. "How upsetting." Clara Bell, knitting a crooked mitten, nodded. "I saw Emily at the church, looking like she'd lost her best friend. She said Tom had been sneaking around, meeting someone at night." Mrs. Dane, her scarf a vivid blue today, chimed in. "I heard Tom was at the pub with a stranger last week, a rough-looking man. They were whispering about money." Miss Marple's needles clicked faster. A broken engagement, a letter, a stranger. It was a tangle, and she loved untangling knots. She remembered a story from her youth about a jilted lover who'd turned to revenge after finding a secret note. Was Emily's heartbreak hiding something darker? The next morning, Miss Marple walked to the village shop, her basket swinging lightly. Mrs. Green, the shopkeeper, was dusting shelves, her tongue as busy as ever. "Emily bought a new lock for her door yesterday," she said. "She didn't feel safe. Poor girl's scared of something." Miss Marple nodded, picking out a skein of white wool. "Scared? That's a shame." Her mind was racing. A new lock meant fear, and fear meant danger. She thought of Tom, a strong lad with a quick temper, always hammering away at the forge. Was he angry enough to hurt Emily? That afternoon she visited Emily's cottage, a small place with daisies by the door. Emily answered, her eyes red from crying. "Miss Marple, it's kind of you to come," she said, her voice shaky. "I'm just a mess." Miss Marple patted her hand, offering a jar of her homemade jam. "Breakups are hard, dear," she said. "Do you want to talk about it?" Emily hesitated, then spilled the story. "I found a letter in Tom's coat," she whispered. "It was from a man asking for money to keep a secret. Tom's been acting strange ever since, sneaking out, coming back late. I couldn't marry someone hiding things." Miss Marple's heart quickened, but her face stayed calm. A secret? How troubling. She sipped her tea, her mind spinning. Blackmail was an ugly word, and it fit this puzzle like a missing stitch. Back home, she sat by her window, knitting and thinking. Tom's late nights, the stranger, the letter, it smelled like trouble, maybe even violence. She remembered a case where a young man, blackmailed over a debt, had lashed out at the wrong person. Was Tom being pushed too far? On Wednesday, Miss Marple went to the pub, where Joe the barman was polishing glasses. "Seen Tom Reed lately?" she asked, sipping lemonade. Joe nodded. "He's been here a lot, looking worried. Met a man last night, big fellow with a scar. They argued about money, then left together. Miss Marple's needles, tucked in her bag, seemed to click in her head. A scarred man, a letter, Tom's anger. It was a dangerous mix. She walked to the forge, where Tom was hammering iron, his face dark. "Good day, Tom," she called, her smile kind. "Hard at work, I see." He grunted, barely looking up. "Plenty to do," he said, his voice tight. Miss Marple noticed his hands, bruised and scraped, like he'd been in a fight. She smiled and moved on, but her heart was pounding. Bruises meant trouble. At the knitting circle that evening, the gossip was hotter than ever. Mrs. Price whispered, "Tom was seen near the old barn last night, shouting at someone. And Emily's been locking her doors tight." Clara added, "I saw that scarred man near her cottage. Looked like he was watching her." Miss Marple's needles moved faster. A blackmailer, a fight, a scared girl. It was a story she'd heard before, and it never ended well. She invited Emily for tea the next day, hoping to learn more. "Tom won't talk to me," Emily said, twisting her handkerchief. "He says it's for my safety, but I'm scared. That man he met, he looked dangerous." Miss Marple poured more tea, her eyes gentle. "Did you keep the letter, dear?" she asked. Emily nodded, pulling a crumpled note from her pocket. It read, "Pay up, or everyone knows about the fire." Miss Marple's heart skipped. A fire? She remembered a barn blaze years ago, blamed on a storm, but whispers had pointed to Tom, then just a boy, playing with matches. On Friday, the village awoke to a shock. Emily's garden gate was smashed, and a threatening note was nailed to her door. "Leave or else." The constable was called, and the village buzzed with fear. Miss Marple went to see Tom at the forge, her basket over her arm. "Terrible news about Emily's gate," she said softly. "You must be worried." Tom's hammer paused, his eyes dark. "I'd never hurt her," he muttered. "It's that man, trying to scare her." Miss Marple nodded, her mind racing. She went to the constable, her voice calm. "You might look for a man with a scar, and ask Tom about a fire years ago." The constable, used to her hints, searched the old barn. They found the scarred man hiding there, with a stash of cash and more threatening notes. Under questioning, he admitted blackmailing Tom over the old fire, which Tom had caused by accident as a child. The man had demanded money to keep quiet, then targeted Emily to pressure Tom further. Tom, desperate to protect her, had fought him, explaining the bruises. The constable arrested the blackmailer, and Tom confessed to Emily about the fire, begging his forgiveness. She took him back, the engagement restored. On Sunday, the village church was full, and Emily hugged Miss Marple, tears in her eyes. "You saved us," she said. Miss Marple smiled, picking up her knitting. "People talk, dear," she said. "I just listen." But as her needles clicked, she felt a chill. The blackmailer had mentioned a boss in town, a hint of a bigger scheme lurking in St. Mary Mead. She'd be ready when it surfaced.
Chapter 7. The Baker's Dozen of Deceit. The morning air in St. Mary Mead was crisp, carrying the warm scent of fresh bread from the village bakery. Miss Jane Marple stood at her gate, her knitting basket tucked under her arm, watching villagers hurry past with their shopping bags. Her sharp eyes, hidden behind a gentle smile, caught every detail. The way Mrs. Price, the baker's wife, rushed to open the shop, her face tight with worry. Miss Marple's needles might be still, but her mind was spinning, ready to catch the gossip that swirled through the village like flour dust. Today her thoughts were on the bakery, where Mrs. Price had been acting odd. Usually chatty, she'd been quiet lately, her smiles forced. Miss Marple had heard whispers at the church about a strange incident, a customer claiming a loaf held a hidden note.
Gossip was the village's heartbeat, and Miss Marple knew how to feel its pulse. She strolled to the bakery, her steps slow but sure. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of yeast and sugar. Mrs. Price was behind the counter, her apron dusted with flour, her hands fidgeting. "Good morning, Miss Marple," she said, her voice a bit too high. "A loaf today?" "Just some rolls, dear," Miss Marple replied, her eyes scanning the shop. "Heard you had a bit of excitement. A note and a loaf?" Mrs. Price's face paled. "Oh, that was nothing," she said quickly. "Just a prank, probably. Silly customer making a fuss." But her hands shook as she bagged the rolls. Miss Marple smiled, paying for her bread. "Pranks can be troublesome," she said softly. Her mind was already working. A note in a loaf wasn't a prank. It was a message, and messages meant secrets. Back home, she sat by her window, knitting a soft green scarf. Her needles clicked steadily, but her thoughts were on the bakery. She remembered a story from her youth about a baker who hid stolen money in bread to pass it to a thief. Could something similar be happening here? Mrs. Price's nerves suggested more than a bad day. At the village shop later, Mrs. Green was stacking jars, her tongue wagging. She said, "That note was no prank," she whispered. "Mr. Harris found it in his loaf, said it was a threat, something about pay or else. He showed it to the constable, but Mrs. Price swears she knows nothing." Miss Marple nodded, picking out a skein of wool. A threat? How dreadful! Her heart quickened. Threats in bread were bold, desperate even. She thought of Mr. Price, the baker, a quiet man who worked late, his hands always dusted with flour. Was he hiding something? That afternoon she visited the bakery again, bringing a jar of her homemade jam as an excuse. Mr. Price was kneading dough, his face red from the oven's heat. "Good to see you, Miss Marple," he said, his voice gruff. "Busy day." "I'm sure," she said, her eyes on the counter. A crumpled piece of paper lay half hidden by a flour sack. "You must be tired, working such long hours." He shrugged, but his eyes flicked to the paper. "Gotta keep the ovens going," he mumbled, turning away. Miss Marple smiled and left, but her mind was racing. That paper looked like the note Mrs. Green described. Small, folded, dangerous. At the church knitting circle that evening, the ladies were buzzing. Clara Bell, twisting her yarn, said, "I saw Mr. Price at the station yesterday, carrying a heavy sack. Looked like he didn't want anyone to see." Mrs. Dane, her scarf bright orange, nodded. "He's been getting odd deliveries at the bakery. Boxes, not flour or sugar, something heavy. I saw one in the post office addressed to him from town." Miss Marple's needles moved faster. Heavy boxes? How curious. She remembered a case where a shopkeeper hid stolen goods in crates of apples. Was Mr. Price using his bakery as a front? That night she stopped by the pub for a pinch of lemonade. Joe the barman was wiping glasses. "Heard about the bakery trouble?" she asked, sipping lemonade. Joe leaned close. "Mr. Price was here last night talking to a man in a dark coat. They mentioned debts and one last job. Sounded serious." Miss Marple's heart skipped, but her face stayed calm. Debts, threats, secret deliveries, it was a puzzle, and she was close to solving it. She thought of her old neighbor who had been caught smuggling jewels in crates of apples. Was Mr. Price in debt? Forced to hide something in his bread? On Friday, she invited Clara for tea, hoping for more clues. "Mr. Price has been kind to me," Clara said, sipping tea. "But he's been so jumpy. I saw him hide a box in the bakery cellar last week." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. A box in the cellar? How interesting. She poured more tea, her mind spinning. A cellar was a good hiding place, but for what? That evening she sat in her garden knitting under the fading light. Across the village, the bakery's lights were on late, Mr. Price's shadow moving behind the curtains. She noticed a man in a dark coat slip out the back, carrying a small sack. Her needles paused. Was he the same man Joe saw? On Thursday, the village woke to a stir. Another customer found a note in a loaf, this one saying, "Last chance, pay up." The constable was called, and Mrs. Price was in tears, swearing she knew nothing. Miss Marple visited the bakery, her basket over her arm. "Such a shame about these notes," she said to Mr. Price, her voice gentle. "Must be hard on you." He wiped his hands on his apron, his eyes darting. "Just a prank," he muttered. "Nothing to it." But his voice was tight, like a string about to snap. Miss Marple smiled and left, but her heart was pounding. She went to the constable, her voice calm. "You might check the bakery's cellar," she said, "and ask about a man in a dark coat." The constable, trusting her hints, searched the bakery that night. In the cellar, they found boxes of stolen watches, hidden among flour sacks. The notes in the loaves were warnings from a loan shark pressuring Mr. Price to pay his gambling debts by hiding the goods in his bread. The man in the dark coat was his contact, collecting the watches to sell in town. Mr. Price broke down, admitting he'd been desperate, scared for his family. The constable arrested the loan shark, and Mr. Price promised to make things right. Mrs. Price hugged Miss Marple, tears in her eyes. "You saved us," she said at church on Sunday. The village buzzed with the story, but Miss Marple just smiled, picking up her knitting. "People talk, dear," she said. "I just listen." But as her needles clicked, she felt a prickle of unease. The loan shark had mentioned a bigger boss in town, tied to other village troubles. It was a thread, thin but strong, leading to a larger web. Miss Marple knew she'd need to keep listening.
Chapter 8. Echoes from the Echoing Green. The evening light draped St. Mary Mead in a soft, golden haze, the village green alive with children's laughter and the rustle of leaves. Miss Jane Marple sat on a bench by the green, her knitting needles clicking as she worked on a creamy yellow scarf. To passers-by, she was just an old lady enjoying the fading day, but her sharp blue eyes caught every detail. The hurried steps, the sidelong glances, the whispers carried on the breeze. Gossip was the village's pulse, and Miss Marple knew how to check it. Her thoughts were on the green, where old friends often met to chat and share stories. Yesterday, she'd overheard Mrs. Price and Mrs. Dane talking about a stranger seen near the green, a man claiming to be a long-lost cousin of the Wilsons, a quiet family who lived by the church. The man calling himself Robert Wilson had arrived last week, charming everyone with his easy smile. But Miss Marple sensed something off. His stories were too polished, his eyes too quick. At the village shop the next morning, Miss Marple bought a tin of biscuits, her ears tuned to Mrs. Green's chatter. "That Robert's been asking about the Wilsons' old house," Mrs. Green said, stacking jars. "Says he's family, but he's been poking around their attic looking for papers. Seems odd for a cousin." Miss Marple's heart quickened, but her face stayed calm. "Papers?" she said, her voice soft. "How curious." She paid for her biscuits and walked home, her mind spinning. A stranger digging for papers wasn't just nosy, it was suspicious. She remembered a case from her youth where a man posed as relative to steal an inheritance. Was Robert Wilson who he claimed? Back home, she sat by her window, knitting and thinking. Her needles clicked like a ticking clock, steady and sure. The Wilsons were simple folk. Mr. Wilson worked at the bank. Mrs. Wilson tended her garden. They had no children, but their old house held family records, maybe even a will. Robert's sudden arrival felt like a fox in a henhouse.
At the church knitting circle that afternoon, the ladies were buzzing. Clarabelle, twisting her yarn, said, "I saw Robert at the Wilsons' yesterday. He was carrying a box, looked heavy. Mrs. Wilson seemed nervous, kept watching him." Mrs. Price nodded, nibbling a biscuit. "He's been asking about old Mr. Wilson's safe. Says it's for family history, but I don't buy it. He's too slick." Miss Marple's needles moved faster. A safe? How interesting. She remembered a story about a con man who'd posed as a nephew to swindle a widow. Identity theft was an old trick, but it still worked in sleepy villages like this. The next day, Miss Marple visited the Wilsons' cottage, bringing a jar of her homemade jam. Mrs. Wilson answered, her face pale, her hands fidgeting with her apron. "Miss Marple, how kind," she said, her voice thin. "Come in." They sat in the parlor, where a dusty photo of old Mr. Wilson sat on the mantel. Miss Marple noticed a new lock on the desk. "You've had a visitor, I hear," she said gently. "A cousin." Mrs. Wilson's eyes darted to the desk. "Yes, Robert. He's been helpful, looking through family papers. Says he's tracing our roots." Miss Marple smiled, sipping tea. "How nice. Found anything interesting?" Mrs. Wilson hesitated. "Some old letters, a will. He's very eager, but I don't know. Something feels wrong." Miss Marple's heart skipped, but her face stayed kind. A will, a stranger, a nervous wife. It was a puzzle, and she was close to solving it. She left, her eyes catching a glimpse of Robert outside, talking to a man in a gray cap by the green. They looked secretive, heads close. That evening she sat in her garden, knitting under the fading light. Robert passed by, his smile too wide. "Evening, Miss Marple," he called. "Lovely night." "Indeed," she replied, her needles steady, but her mind was racing. The man in the gray cap was new, and new meant trouble. On Wednesday, she went to the pub where Joe the barman was wiping glasses. "Seen that Robert Wilson?" she asked, sipping lemonade. Joe nodded. "He's been here with a fellow in a gray cap, talking about selling something valuable. Sounded like they were in a hurry." Miss Marple's needles, tucked in her bag, seemed to click in her head. Selling something? A will, maybe? Or forged papers to claim the Wilsons' house? She remembered a case where a fake heir sold a family's land before anyone noticed. Was Robert planning the same? At the post office the next day, Mrs. Dane was sorting letters, her scarf bright red. "Robert sent a package to town," she said. "Heavy, like it was full of books or papers. Looked nervous when he handed it over." Miss Marple nodded. "Nervous? How odd." She bought stamps, her mind spinning. A package meant evidence, and evidence meant a plan in motion. On Friday, the village awoke to a stir. Mr. Wilson found his safe open, old family papers missing, including a will naming a distant cousin, supposedly Robert. The constable was called, and the Wilsons were in a panic. Miss Marple visited, her basket over her arm. "Such a shame," she said to Mrs. Wilson. "Did Robert know about the safe?" Mrs. Wilson's eyes filled with tears. "He asked about it, said it was for family history. I trusted him." Miss Marple patted her hand. "People can be tricky, dear." She left, her eyes catching a glimpse of Robert outside, talking to a man in a gray cap by the green. At church the next day, Mrs. Wilson hugged Miss Marple, her face bright with relief. "You saved our home," she said. Miss Marple smiled, picking up her knitting. "People talk, dear," she said. "I just listen." But as her needles clicked, she felt a chill. The forger had mentioned a boss in town, the same hint she'd heard before. A bigger web was forming in St. Mary Mead, and Miss Marple knew she'd need to keep her ears open.
Chapter 9. The Seamstress's Stitches of Suspicion. The morning sun sparkled over St. Mary Mead, casting a warm glow on the village's cobblestone paths. Miss Jane Marple sat in her cozy parlor, her knitting needles clicking as she worked on a soft peach scarf. From her window, she watched villagers bustle by, their chatter floating like dandelion seeds. To anyone passing, she was just an old lady knitting, but her sharp blue eyes caught every glance, every whisper. Gossip was the village's lifeblood, and Miss Marple knew how to sip it carefully. Today her mind was on the seamstress's shop, a tiny place tucked between the bakery and the post office. Mrs. Lane, the seamstress, was known for her neat stitches and sharp tongue, but lately she'd been quiet, her eyes darting nervously. Miss Marple had heard whispers at the church about a wedding gown gone wrong, a dress for young Sarah Cole's wedding, rumored to hold a hidden message. In St. Mary Mead, a misplaced stitch could unravel a secret, and Miss Marple was ready to tug the thread. She tucked her knitting into her basket and strolled to the seamstress's shop, her steps slow but sure. Inside, the air smelled of fabric and lavender, with bolts of cloth stacked high. Mrs. Lane was pinning a hem, her hands quick but unsteady. "Good morning, Miss Marple," she said, her voice tight. "Need a mend?" "Just looking for some lace," Miss Marple replied, her smile gentle. "Heard you're making Sarah's wedding gown. Must be beautiful." Mrs. Lane's needle paused. "It's coming along," she said, her eyes flicking to a covered dress in the corner. "Sarah's picky, that's all." Miss Marple nodded, her heart quickening. Picky, or worried about something. Her voice was soft, but her mind was sharp. She paid for a bit of lace and left, her thoughts on that dress. A hidden message wasn't just a rumor, it was a clue. Back home, she sat by her fire, knitting and thinking. Her needles clicked like a steady heartbeat. She remembered a story from her girlhood about a thief who'd sewn stolen jewels into a coat's lining. Could Mrs. Lane be hiding something in Sarah's gown? And why? At the village shop later, Mrs. Green was stacking tins, her tongue wagging. "Sarah was in here all upset," she said. "Said her gown's got strange stitches, like a pattern that doesn't belong. She thinks Mrs. Lane's up to something." Miss Marple's eyebrows lifted. "A pattern? How curious." She bought a skein of wool, her mind racing. Patterns in stitches could be a code, a message for someone. She thought of Sarah, a sweet girl, marrying John Hart, a farmer's son. Was the gown hiding a secret about their wedding? That afternoon she visited the church knitting circle, where the ladies were buzzing. Clara Bell, twisting her yarn, said, "I saw Mrs. Lane at the shop, buying a fancy lock for her back door. Looked scared, like someone was after her." Mrs. Price nodded, nibbling a biscuit. "And Sarah's been crying. Says John's been getting odd letters demanding money. She thinks it's tied to the gown." Miss Marple's needles moved faster. Letters? How troubling. She remembered a case where a dressmaker hid stolen goods in a bride's dress to smuggle them out. Was Mrs. Lane being forced to help? On Thursday, she visited Sarah's cottage, bringing a jar of her homemade jam. Sarah answered, her eyes red. "Miss Marple, it's kind of you," she said, her voice shaky. "I'm so worried about the gown." Miss Marple patted her hand. "Tell me, dear," she said, sipping tea. "What's wrong with it?" Sarah bit her lip. "There's a pattern in the hem, tiny stitches like letters. I showed John and he got angry, said it's dangerous. He's been getting notes, telling him to pay or the wedding is off." Miss Marple's heart skipped. A pattern like letters? How strange. She left, her mind spinning. Stitches that spelled something, meant a message, maybe a threat. She thought of Sarah, a sweet girl, marrying John Hart, a farmer's son. Was the gown hiding a secret about their wedding? On Wednesday, she visited the seamstress's shop again, her basket over her arm. Mrs. Lane was sewing, her face pale. She noticed a small box under the counter, half hidden by fabric. "Busy with the gown?" she asked, her voice gentle. "Nearly done," she said, her eyes on the box. "Just tricky work." Miss Marple smiled, but her heart was pounding. That box looked heavy,
like it held more than thread. She left, her thoughts on smuggling. Could Mrs. Lane be passing something through the gown? At the pub that evening, she sipped lemonade and chatted with Joe, the barman. "Seen anyone odd around Mrs. Lane's shop?" she asked. Joe nodded. "A man in a black cap, hanging around the back. Met Mrs. Lane last night. Looked like they were arguing." Miss Marple's needles, tucked in her bag, seemed to click in her head. A stranger? A nervous seamstress? A coated gown? It was a puzzle, and she was close to solving it. She remembered a case where a thief used a dress to smuggle stolen jewels across a border. Was Mrs. Lane being forced to help? On Thursday, the village awoke to a stir. Sarah's gown was found torn in her garden, the strange stitches ripped out. A note was pinned to it. "Keep quiet, or worse." The constable was called, and Sarah was in tears. Miss Marple visited, her voice calm. "It's such a shame about the gown," she said. "Did you see those stitches up close?" Sarah nodded, showing a scrap of fabric. The stitches formed tiny letters, "Pay or lose all." Miss Marple's heart raced. A threat sewn into a wedding gown was bold, desperate. She went to the constable, her voice soft. "You might check Mrs. Lane's shop," she said. "Look for a box under the counter and ask about a man in a black cap." The constable, trusting her hints, searched the shop that night. In the box, they found stolen jewels, emeralds and pearls, hidden to be smuggled in Sarah's gown. Mrs. Lane confessed, tears streaming. She'd been threatened by the man in the black cap, a thief who'd forced her to hide the jewels or face harm. The notes to John were to scare him into paying protection money, tied to the same gang. The constable arrested the thief, and the jewels were returned to their owner in town. Sarah's gown was remade, and the wedding was back on. On Sunday, Sarah hugged Miss Marple at church, her face bright. "You saved my wedding," she said. Miss Marple smiled, picking up her knitting. "People talk, dear," she said. "I just listen." But as her needles clicked, she felt a prickle. The thief had mentioned a boss in town, the same shadowy figure from other cases. A larger web was tightening around St. Mary Mead, and Miss Marple knew she'd need to keep her eyes open.
Chapter 10. Harvest of Hearsay. The autumn sun hung low over St. Mary Mead, painting the fields golden as the village prepared for its annual harvest fair. Miss Jane Marple sat on her porch, knitting a warm brown scarf, her needles clicking like a steady heartbeat. From her vantage point, she watched villagers cart pumpkins and hay bales to the green, their chatter drifting like falling leaves. To anyone passing, she was just an old lady enjoying the season, but her sharp blue eyes caught every glance, every whispered word. Gossip grew thick in St. Mary Mead, especially at the fair, and Miss Marple knew how to sift through it for truth. Her thoughts were on the fair, where farmers like old Mr. Gibbs showed off their crops and swapped stories. Yesterday, she'd overheard Mrs. Price at the shop, whispering about a feud between Mr. Gibbs and young Will Carter, a new farmer who'd bought land nearby. The talk was heated, something about a land dispute turning ugly. Miss Marple's instincts tingled. Disputes over land could dig up old grudges, and grudges sometimes led to darker deeds. She tucked her knitting into her basket and strolled to the fair, her steps slow but sure. The green was alive with stalls, the air thick with the smell of cider and roasted chestnuts. Mr. Gibbs stood by his pumpkins, his face red with anger, as he argued with Will, who clutched a sheaf of papers. Miss Marple lingered nearby, pretending to admire a squash. "You cheated me," Mr. Gibbs snapped, his voice carrying. "That land's been mine for years. Your papers are lies." Will, tall and wiry, shook his head. "It's legal, Gibbs. The deed's mine now." His voice was calm, but his eyes were hard. Miss Marple's heart quickened, but her face stayed serene. She moved to the cider stall where Mrs. Green was pouring drinks,
her tongue as busy as her hands. "Heard about Gibbs and Carter?" Mrs. Green said, handing Miss Marple a cup. "Gibbs swears Will's deed is fake, says he'll do anything to keep his land." Miss Marple nodded, sipping cider. A fake deed? How troubling! Her mind raced. She remembered a case from her youth where a forged deed led to a murder over a farm. Was Will Carter hiding something, or was Mr. Gibbs too stubborn to see reason? Back home, she sat by her window, knitting and thinking. Her needles clicked like a ticking clock. Mr. Gibbs was proud, his family tied to that land for generations. Will, new to the village, had money nobody could explain. New tools, a shiny cart. A fake deed meant motive, and motive meant danger. At the church knitting circle that evening, the ladies were buzzing. Clara Bell, twisting her yarn, said, "I saw Will at the station, sending a package. Looked heavy, like papers or metal. He was nervous, kept looking around." Mrs. Price nodded, nibbling a scone. "And Gibbs was at the pub, shouting about revenge. Said he'll make Will pay for stealing his land." Miss Marple's needles moved faster. Revenge? How sad. She remembered a story about a farmer driven to violence over a lost field. Was Mr. Gibbs angry enough to act? The next day, she visited Mr. Gibbs' farm, bringing a jar of her homemade jam. He was in his barn, sharpening a scythe, his face dark. "Good morning, Mr. Gibbs," she said, her voice gentle. "Your pumpkins were the talk of the fair." He grunted, barely looking up. "Won't mean much if Carter takes my land. His deed's a lie, but nobody listens." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes on the scythe. "Papers can be tricky," she said. "Have you seen his deed?" "Saw it. Looks real, but I know my land. He's a cheat." She smiled and left, her heart pounding. A deed that looked real but wasn't? That smelled like forgery, and forgery smelled like trouble. She thought of Will's package at the station. Was it tied to the deed? On Wednesday, she went to the post office, where Mrs. Dane was sorting letters, her scarf bright yellow. "Heard about Will's package?" she asked, buying stamps. Mrs. Dane nodded. "Heavy. Sent to a lawyer in town. Will said it was business, but he was sweating, like he was scared." Miss Marple's needles, tucked in her bag, seemed to click in her head. A package to a lawyer meant legal trouble, or a cover-up. She walked home, her mind spinning. Will's money, the deed, the package. It was a puzzle, and she was close to solving it. That evening, she sat in her garden, knitting under the fading light. Will's cart rolled by, loaded with sacks, and a man in a dark hat sat beside him. They spoke in low voices, their eyes scanning the road. Miss Marple's needles paused. A stranger, again just like in other village troubles. On Thursday, the village awoke to a shock. Mr. Gibbs was found unconscious in his field, a gash on his head. A broken scythe lay nearby, and Will's deed was clutched in his hand, torn. The constable was called, and the village buzzed with fear. Miss Marple visited Mr. Gibbs' farm, where his wife was in tears. "He went to confront Will last night. Now this," she said. Miss Marple patted her hand, but her eyes were on the torn deed. It looked official, but the edges were wrong, like a cheap copy. She remembered a case where a forged deed led to an attack to silence a witness. Was Will desperate enough to hurt Mr. Gibbs? She went to the pub, where Joe the barman was wiping glasses. "Seen Will Carter with anyone odd?" she asked, sipping lemonade. Joe nodded. "That man in the dark hat. They were here last night talking about a deal. Will looked scared, kept saying he needed more time." Miss Marple's heart raced. A deal, a forged deed, an attack. It was coming together. On Friday, she invited Clara for tea, hoping for more clues. "I saw Will burning papers in his yard," Clara said, twisting her handkerchief. "Looked like he was hiding something." Miss Marple poured more tea, her mind spinning. Burning papers? How curious! She thought of the package, the deed, the stranger. Will wasn't just a farmer, he was a pawn in a bigger game. That night she went to the constable, her voice calm. "You might check Will's burned papers," she said, "and ask about a man in a dark hat at the station." The constable, trusting her instincts, searched Will's farm. In the ashes, they found bits of a forged deed matching the one Mr. Gibbs held. The package at the station held more fakes sent to a crooked lawyer in town. The man in the dark hat was a known forger, working for a city gang. Will confessed, admitting he'd been paid to claim Gibbs' land with a fake deed, but panicked when Gibbs confronted him. He'd hit Gibbs in fear, not meaning to hurt him badly. Mr. Gibbs recovered, and his land was safe. The forger and his gang were arrested, and the village sighed in relief. On Sunday, Mrs. Gibbs hugged Miss Marple at church, tears in her eyes. "You saved our home," she said. Miss Marple smiled, picking up her knitting. "People talk, dear," she said. "I just listen." But as her needles clicked, she felt a chill. The forger had mentioned a boss in town, the same shadowy figure from other cases. The web around St. Mary Mead was growing tighter, and Miss Marple knew the harvest of secrets wasn't over.
Chapter 11. The Clockmaker's Ticking Tails. The evening shadows stretched long across St. Mary Mead, the village quiet under a dusky sky. Miss Jane Marple sat by her parlor window, knitting a soft gray shawl, her needles clicking like the steady tick of a clock. From her seat, she watched the street, where lamplight glowed and villagers hurried home. To anyone passing, she was just an old lady knitting, but her sharp blue eyes caught every detail, the quick glance, the hushed word. Gossip ticked through the village like a timepiece, and Miss Marple knew how to wind it. Her thoughts were on Mr. Tuttle, the clockmaker, whose shop sat by the village square. He was a wiry man with nimble fingers, always tinkering with gears and springs. Lately, though, he'd been jumpy, locking his shop early and avoiding talk. Miss Marple had heard whispers at the church about a strange incident. A customer claiming a clock he'd bought stopped at midnight. The same time a shadow was seen near the clock tower. In St. Mary Mead, a stopped clock could mean more than a broken spring. She tucked her knitting into her basket and strolled to the clockmaker's shop, her steps slow but sure. Inside, the air smelled of oil and old wood, clocks ticking in a chorus. Mr. Tuttle was polishing a pocket watch, his hands shaking slightly. "Good morning, Miss Marple," he said, his voice tight. "Need a clock fixed?" "Just looking, dear," she replied, her smile gentle. "Heard you had trouble with a clock stopping at midnight. How odd." Mr. Tuttle's polishing cloth paused. "Just a faulty gear," he said quickly, his eyes darting to a curtained door at the back. "Nothing to it." Miss Marple nodded, her heart quickening. "Faulty gears can be tricky," she said, her voice soft. She paid for a small brass keychain and left, her mind spinning. A clock stopping at midnight wasn't just a glitch, it was a signal. She remembered a case from her youth where a smuggler used a clock's chime to time a drop. Was Mr. Tuttle caught in something? Back home, she sat by her fire, knitting and thinking. Her needles clicked like a metronome. Mr. Tuttle was honest, but his nerves suggested trouble. She thought of the clock tower looming over the village, its bells silent since a storm years ago. Was it tied to the midnight stop?
At the village shop the next day, Mrs. Green was stacking jars, her tongue busy. Mr. Tuttle's been odd. Bought a new lock for his shop, and he's been getting late-night deliveries. Saw a man in a long coat drop off a box last night. Miss Marple's eyebrows lifted. A box? How curious. She bought a skein of wool, her mind racing. Late-night deliveries and a nervous clockmaker smelled like a secret ticking away. At the church knitting circle that evening, the ladies were buzzing. Clara Bell, twisting her yarn, said, "I saw Mr. Tuttle at the clock tower last night, fiddling with the door. Looked like he was hiding something." Mrs. Price nodded, nibbling a biscuit. "And that customer, Mr. Lyle, said his clock stopped at midnight the same night he saw a shadow up there. Spooky, if you ask me." Miss Marple's needles moved faster. A shadow? How strange. She remembered a story about a thief who used a church tower to signal accomplices. Was the clock tower a meeting point? The next day she visited Mr. Tuttle's shop again, bringing a jar of her homemade jam. He was winding a grandfather clock, his face pale. "You're busy," she said, her eyes on the curtained door. "Must be hard, working late." He jumped. "Just keeping up," he mumbled, his eyes flicking to the curtain. Miss Marple smiled, noticing a faint scratch on the floor like a heavy box had been dragged. She left, her heart pounding. Something was hidden back there. That afternoon, she sat in her garden, knitting under the fading light. The clock tower loomed in the distance, its hands frozen at noon. She saw Mr. Tuttle hurry by, glancing over his shoulder, a small bag in his hand. A man in a long coat met him near the tower, their voices low. Her needles paused. Another stranger, just like in other village troubles. On Wednesday, she went to the pub, where Joe the bartender was wiping glasses. "Seen Mr. Tuttle with anyone odd?" she asked, sipping lemonade. Joe nodded. "That man in the long coat. They were here last night talking about a drop at midnight. Tuttle looks scared stiff." Miss Marple's heart raced. A drop at midnight? She thought of the stopped clock, the shadow, the tower. It was a signal, and Mr. Tuttle was caught in it. She remembered a case where a watchmaker hid stolen goods in clock cases. Was Mr. Tuttle doing the same? On Thursday, the village awoke to a shock. Mr. Lyle, the customer, was found unconscious near the clock tower, a gash on his head. A broken clock lay beside him, its hands stuck at midnight. The constable was called, and the village buzzed with fear. Miss Marple visited Mr. Tuttle, her basket over her arm. Such a shame about Mr. Lyle, and that clock, midnight again. Mr. Tuttle's hands shook. "Just a coincidence," he muttered, avoiding her eyes. But his voice was thin, like a spring about to snap. Miss Marple smiled and left, her mind spinning. She went to the constable, her voice calm. "You might check the clock tower and ask about a man in a long coat." The constable, trusting her hints, searched the tower that night. Behind the clock face, they found a hidden bag of stolen coins, dropped there at midnight. Mr. Tuttle confessed, tears in his eyes. He'd been forced by the man in the long coat, a thief who threatened his family unless he hid the coins and signaled with the clock. Mr. Lyle had seen the drop, and the thief had attacked him to keep him quiet. The constable arrested the thief, and the coins were returned to their owner in town. Mr. Lyle recovered, and Mr. Tuttle promised to make amends. On Sunday, he thanked Miss Marple at church, his face bright with relief. "You saved me," he said. Miss Marple smiled, picking up her knitting. "People talk, dear. I just listen." But as her needles clicked, she felt a chill. The thief had mentioned a boss in town, the same shadowy figure from other cases. The web around St. Mary Mead was tightening, and Miss Marple knew the final tick was coming.
Chapter 12. Final Thread. Weaving the Web of Wickedness. The autumn chill settled over St. Mary Mead, the village glowing under a harvest moon. Miss Jane Marple sat in her parlor, knitting a golden scarf, her needles clicking like a quiet heartbeat. From her window she watched the lamplight flicker on cobblestone paths where villagers hurried home, their voices soft but heavy with worry. To anyone passing, she was just an old lady finishing her day, but her sharp blue eyes saw the threads of secrets weaving through the village. Gossip had been her guide all season, and now it was time to tie the knots. For weeks, Miss Marple had unraveled mysteries: stolen necklaces, poison, blackmail, forged deeds, smuggled goods. Each case held the clue, a whisper of a boss in town, a shadowy figure pulling strings. The village was a tapestry of trouble, and she sensed the final pattern was near. The harvest fair was tomorrow, a perfect stage for secrets to spill, and Miss Marple was ready to listen. She tucked her knitting into her basket and strolled to the village green, where fair preparations buzzed. Stalls were draped with lanterns, and the air smelled of cider and hay. But Miss Marple's eyes were on the crowd. Mrs. Price whispering to Mrs. Dane, Clarabelle glancing nervously, Mr. Gibbs checking his pumpkins with a scowl. And there, by the bandstand, was a man she'd seen before, a tall figure in a dark coat, the same city type linked to every crime. He was talking to Mr. Turner, the land cheat from months ago, now out of jail and looking sly. Miss Marple lingered by a stall, her ears tuned. "Tomorrow night," the man in the coat muttered. "Big payout. Don't mess it up." Mr. Turner nodded, his eyes darting. Her heart quickened, but her face stayed calm. A payout meant a plan, and a plan meant danger. At the church knitting circle that evening, the ladies were tense. Mrs. Price, nibbling a biscuit, whispered, "Mr. Turner's been seen with that city man again. They were at the pub, talking about a big job at the fair." Clarabelle, twisting her yarn, nodded. "I saw them near the clock tower, carrying a heavy bag. Looked like trouble." Mrs. Dane, her scarf bright purple, added, "And I heard Mr. Turner mention a name, Mr. Black. Said he's the one calling the shots." Miss Marple's needles paused. Mr. Black. The name had surfaced before, whispered by every crook she'd caught. The necklace thief, the poisoner, the blackmailer, the forger, the smuggled jewels, the coins in the clock tower, all hinted at a boss in town. Her needles clicked faster. The web was tightening, and Mr. Black was the spider. Back home, she sat by her fire, knitting and thinking. Her scarf grew longer, its golden threads like the clues she'd gathered. The necklace theft, the arsenic in tea, the forged deeds, the smuggled jewels, the coins in the clock tower, all crimes were a spoke in a wheel, and Mr. Black was the hub. She remembered a case from her youth where a crime ring used a village as a cover, its leader hiding in plain sight. Was Mr. Black a stranger or someone she passed every day? The next morning she visited the village shop, where Mrs. Green was stacking jars. "Heard about Mr. Turner," Mrs. Green said. "He's been buying fancy things again. New boots, a watch. Says he's expecting money soon." Miss Marple nodded, picking out a skein of wool. Money? How curious! Her mind raced. Mr. Turner's flashiness meant a payoff, and the fair was the perfect place to pass it. She thought of the heavy bag Clara saw. Cash, goods, or something worse. At the fair that afternoon, the village was alive with music and laughter, but Miss Marple's eyes were sharp.
She spotted Mr. Turner by the cider stall, slipping a small package to the man in the dark coat. Nearby, Mr. Finch, the vicar's old assistant, hovered, his slick smile back despite his disgrace. Miss Marple's heart skipped. Too many familiar faces, all tied to past crimes. She sat on a bench, knitting and watching. Joe the barman served drinks, his eyes on the crowd. Mrs. Lane, the seamstress, sold aprons, her hands nervous. Mr. Tuttle, the clockmaker, checked his pocket watch, glancing at the clock tower. Miss Marple's needles clicked like a countdown. The pieces were falling together. A payout, a bag, a boss named Mr. Black. But who was he? That evening she invited Clara for tea, hoping for more clues. "I saw Mr. Turner with that city man again," Clara said, twisting her handkerchief. "They were by the bandstand talking about a final drop at midnight." Miss Marple poured tea, her eyes twinkling. Midnight? How interesting! She thought of the clock tower, its hands stuck since the last case. Was that the meeting point? At the pub, she sipped lemonade and asked Joe, "Seen that man in the dark coat?" Joe nodded. "He calls himself Smith, but I heard Turner call him Black. They're planning something big tonight. Turner looked scared." Miss Marple's heart raced. Mr. Black wasn't just a name. He was here, in St. Mary Mead. She went home, her mind spinning. The fair, the clock tower, the midnight drop. It was the final act. She remembered every case, every hint of a boss. The necklace, the poison, the jewels, the coins. All roads led to Mr. Black. And tonight she'd catch him. She went to the constable, her voice calm. "You might watch the clock tower at midnight. Look for a man in a dark coat and check Mr. Turner's bag." The constable, trusting her instincts, gathered men and staked out the tower. At midnight, they caught Mr. Turner and the man in the dark coat, Mr. Black himself, exchanging a bag of cash and stolen goods. Mr. Black was no stranger. He was a city crook posing as a merchant, using St. Mary Mead as his base. Under questioning, he confessed, naming Mr. Turner, Mr. Finch, and others as his pawns, each running a piece of his crime ring: necklaces, poison, blackmail, forgeries, smuggling. The village had been his playground, but Miss Marple's gossip had undone him. The constable arrested the gang, and St. Mary Meads breathed easy. The fair ended with cheers, the village safe again. On Sunday, the church was packed, and the villagers surprised Miss Marple with a golden knitting needle, engraved with thanks. Clara hugged her, tears shining. "You saved us all," she said. Miss Marple smiled, her needles clicking. "People talk, dear," she said. "I just listen." The golden needle gleamed in her basket, a tribute to her quiet power. As the congregation sang, she felt peace settle over the village. The web was unraveled, the spider caught, and St. Mary Meads was whole again. But her needles kept moving, ready for the next whisper, should it come.